Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Cass, president of the Chesapeake chapter. I'm with Kelly Koster of the Cascade chapter. And we welcome you to part one of our three-part parking series, Parking Pricing. Our speakers today are Joseph Sherlock and Dr. Rachel Weinberger. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. I'm sure you guys are very familiar with all of this. But all the participants will be kept on mute during the presentation. And feel free to add your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll address them during the Q&A session at the end. And again, the webinar is going to be recorded, and it will be placed on the ACT website next week. All righty, well, Kelly is going to introduce one of our speakers. Go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, hey everyone, thank you for being here. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joseph Sherlock. He is an applied behavioral researcher at the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University. He's currently on an extended secondment, a sabbatical, from the central government in the UK, where he is a principal behavioral scientist with HM Revenue and Customs. At the Center for Advanced Hindsight, he leads the government team, which focuses on using behavioral science to bring innovation into civic society. And he just moved houses, and he asked that we do not judge him based on the curtains in his background. All right, back to you, Emily.
Okay, and then our first speaker is Dr. Rachel Weinberger. She's a senior fellow for the transportation at the Regional Plan Association. She has over 30 years of transportation planning experience in public and private sectors and in academia. She's internationally recognized as an expert in sustainable transportation with specializations in travel behavior, land use transportation interactions, economic impacts of the transportation system, and parking policy. She holds a PhD in urban planning and an MS in civil engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. A native New Yorker, she has her BA and MUP from Hunter College of the City University of New York. And she served on the urban planning faculty at the University of Pennsylvania and is currently a member of the adjunct faculty of Columbia University. Dr. Weinberger lives in Brooklyn with her two children. So welcome and take it away, Dr. Rachel.
Well, thank you for the introduction and the honor of going first. And let me see if I can get my screen up here. The logistics are always just as complicated as you want to make them. In any case, I'm gonna go a little bit off script, and I hope that you'll indulge me for a minute as I do that, and then also you'll understand why. I am going to talk. Why did my screen just blank out of the presentation?
We can see the presentation. We see
it as a presentation. It's showing
no,
all of a sudden as the PowerPoint.
Right, it's not in presentation mode
anymore. It wasn't in presentation. There you go. We're back again.
We're back.
And now my screen's just blanked out completely. I'm gonna have to I guess I'll have to show it as the presentation because you guys just saw what happened, which is kind of nice for me because I'll be able to see my slides as they're coming up.
We can no longer hear you.
Uh-oh.
We still can't hear you. See if she's able to reconnect, and if not, we can just maybe flip the order and Joey can go first. Yeah. Does that sound good, Rachel? Just to have. Okay. All right, Joey. I think you've been moved to go first, and then hopefully we can get. And I would just say, Rachel, maybe try logging out and back into the meeting.
She's going to try from a different machine. So while she's working on that, we'll have Joey go.
Cool. Can you all see slides, team? Cool.
Yes, we can.
All right, so I'll just run with it. So today, I think my plan is to chew through a series of studies that we've been working on applying behavioral science to parking pricing. So I might just start by sort of recognizing some of the partners involved. So the studies I'll share now are part of the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge, which we're a part of with the City of Durham. So this work very much ties back to that challenge, and the sort of, it's an ongoing 3-year program, and we're sort of mid-flow on that. And also it's sort of clear as we go through, but the main sort of research partner on this in terms of being able to run the studies is Vanderbilt University. So they're the sort of the home of where the research is taking place. And also give a shout out to Jessica Roberts, who was really instrumental in setting this up, and also to Loom, who have also been sort of a strong pillar as we've gone through. So today, I plan to do 5 main things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about some of the behavioral theory as it applies to parking pricing and some of the literature. Really just going to scratch the surface here. There's quite a lot that could be said. And I'm sure that Rachel will get into some of this in more detail as well. So I'll just going to scratch the surface there. Then I'll talk through 4 studies. The first one is a lab study, which is a little bit tangential to parking pricing, but you'll see shortly. And then 3 field studies that relate to parking in some way. One of which is run, one we have some sort of early data on, and one which crashed, but it's in there anyway because we want to be clear about all the stuff we're working on. Okay, so with that, I'll jump into behavioral theories. So start with the problem. Of course, we're all sort of aware of this, but driving is a real problem, and it's likely going to become, so the data here is 2017. We have 76% of people commute by driving. That has likely, this is census data, so when we get the new census data, that's probably going to go up depending on when things are measured around the pandemic. But we know that driving and driving alone is a problem, and it isn't something that we're making great headway on. So we need to try and tackle this. And parking is, the pricing of parking is one of the sort of fundamental levers that we can pull. So, we talk a lot about adding fuel, so adding motivation to get people to not drive and park. And so this is, giving people, we have research on personalized routes and, giving people information at the right time. There's lots of research on different types of incentives to get people out of their cars. But really one of the biggest ways we can prevent driving is to add friction into the process. And the best way to do that is to play with the friction around parking. So we're particularly interested in zooming in on parking and zooming in on how we can structure it to increase and dial up the amount of perceived friction and felt friction around that. And we know that this is a really, as an area, we're certainly not the first ones to be trying to do this. There's lots of really great research out there. We have a very detailed lit review on all of the stuff that's come out of it. One in particular study, it's sort of a before and after with several things changed, but the Seattle Children's Hospital played with this and saw some promising, I wouldn't say they're experimental, but sort of they have some promising results there. There's also some research from MIT that's really good. There's some research from Singapore, which is also good. And then of course, Shoop has done loads and loads of stuff. So there's quite a bit of literature out there, but we are lacking the sort of killer randomized control trial particularly on daily parking. What is the impact of daily parking on behavior? And that's something that I'm not going to answer in this presentation, but I think we as a field need to crack that. So some of the psychological things that are going on then, and I'm going to particularly zoom in on the difference between sort of annual parking, where you pay annually, versus daily parking. I'm going to draw out some of the psychological distinctions between these 2 programs. So when we think about, these going to come in nicely. Oh, my clicks are going to go wrong. Okay. So when we think about annual parking, so you pay in one lump sum at the beginning of the year, or even monthly. You're paying in one lump sum at the beginning of the month. Really, there's a low pain of payment for this, right? So you're paying in a way that you don't even really realize you're paying. You're paying in one big chunk, so you're just gone. Also, if it's monthly, it's probably set up so that you pay sort of in the background. It's an automatic direct deposit, and so you're not really aware of it. So that awareness of payment, that pain of payment, is really, really low for this type of strategy or this type of program. There's a sunk cost component to this type of structure. So if you've paid at the beginning of the month or the beginning of the year, you then have basically bought an all-you-can-eat parking buffet, and you would be, you know, in economic terms, a moron not to maximize your utility and drive as much as you physically could. So it's a really poor design there. You know, we're setting up this sunk cost around parking, and of course there's this status quo bias. You know, this if you've signed up for a monthly reoccurring parking payment, then that just keeps rolling, like your phone bill or your gym membership just keeps rolling unless you do anything otherwise. And of course it's silent in the background with a low payment. So we're setting up this program with lots of psychological levers going in the wrong direction. We're kind of creating this nightmare situation where it just makes sense and is easier for people to maximize the amount that they get out of a parking program, and so drive and park. So broadly, across the board, our research is looking to try and explore this and tackle this and get at some of the behavioral elements. We've sort of been nibbling around the fringes, and so next I'll start to talk through the studies, but this is sort of the foundation and the pillars of what we're trying to work with. So to sort of go sideways a little bit, and the first study I'm going to talk to you about is a lab study we ran. And this lab study came out of our research on personalized routes. So we're playing with giving people personalized routes, and we find that these showing how someone can get from their home address to their work address, and all of the benefits associated with not driving on that route. So health benefits, financial benefits, the time they might save. We find that this sort of kitchen sink intervention is really effective and leads fewer people to report that they drive alone to work. One of the challenges with the way we set up those studies is we weren't really sure which benefit was the biggest motivator for people. So, you know, if you're going to, for example, cycle to work rather than drive to work, it's probable that you're going to get more exercise, that you're going to burn more calories. It might be that you can save time, or at least your time is used more productively because you're exercising while you're doing it. And you're almost definitely reducing fewer emissions while doing it. So there's sort of several benefits here, and we don't know which one is the strongest driver. So we wanted to run a lab study to get at that. So what we did is we designed this online hypothetical scenario where we gave people a sort of frame on different commute choices, hypothetical frame, and we asked them to pick which option they would pick. So here you can see the 6 different conditions we had. So we had a control group where we just laid out, here are the options. We put driving at the top as the sort of status quo, the most pervasive. And we said, you know, pick your option. I'll give you an example of what that looks like shortly. And then we had 5 other conditions where we had one where we just reversed the order. So we put the sustainable modes at the top rather than driving at the top. And then we had 4 frames where we added in either a calorie frame, a productivity frame, a financial frame, or a CO2 frame. So I want just to say this is an online study, and we had 815 participants through MTurk. So here is an example of what they look like. So this is actually the cost frame. So you can see here, we give people the choice between walking, cycling, busing, getting the train, carpooling, and driving alone. This one is as you can see, is flipped. So driving alone is on the bottom, walking is on the top. And on this one, we add in the cost frame. So walking and cycling is free, busing is $2.25, and on we go. This is an about squiggle. So carpooling is about $1.50, driving alone is about $3. If we go on, you can see we've done the same thing with emissions, but we've added in the amount of CO2 burned for each of these. Same with calories, the amount of calories that an individual would burn on average. And then this one's a bit quirky, but it's a productive time one. So basically ranking them on how productive your time is likely to be: highly productive, slightly productive, moderate, etc. You get the idea. So we ran these 6 conditions in a lab study, and I'll ask now that have a think about which one of these do you think is going to be most effective. So we have, just flipping the order, and then we have flipping the order plus cost, flipping the order plus emissions, flipping the order plus calories, flipping the order plus productivity. Which one do you think is best? Have a little think about that. But the punchline is we see, so this is the control, we see about 30% of people choose to not drive. 30% of people choose to drive. And then we see that, I've got my axes wrong again. Basically, we're seeing an increase in sustainable mode use as we go up here through just reversing the order, calories, productivity, cost, and emissions. And we see that the emissions one leads the most people to self-report that they would, in this sort of hypothetical scenario, pick a sustainable mode. And it gets up to just over 60%. And this one is statistically significant. I think all are significant to the control, but this is the only one that is statistically better than just reversing the order, suggesting that calories and almost cost are an add value in terms of getting people to say that they would not drive relative to just reversing the order. So in a line, it looks like maybe money, maybe the environment are the biggest drivers. So it's just a lab study, online participants, hypothetical, all of those problems. So we wanted to take this into some field studies. So we ran 3 field studies now with Vanderbilt University. The first of which looks at getting people to back to daily parking, getting people to opt in to a daily parking program that they were just launching and just getting set up. The second one looks at the impact of that daily parking program. And the third one looks at the impact of parking receipts. So think an Uber receipt, but a parking receipt. So I'll now chew through these 3 studies. And this first one builds directly from that lab study. So this first one, again, is email. So we have, this is done in about August, and we have people who are coming back to a semester at the school, and they have this option of signing up for this new daily parking program, and they receive an email which encourages them to opt in to be part of this program. Now we had 4 different conditions, 4 different versions of that email. We had one, which was the control, which was just as is, the status quo, what would have happened had we done nothing. The second one, we, like that lab study, we just flipped the order. So rather than having, here is your annual parking option, and then below that, hey, you could do daily parking, we flipped it. So it's just, here's daily parking, and then below that, you could do annual. And then we had these 2 additions where we took the best 2 performers from our lab study, so financial frame and environmental frame, and just added those in as well. So this one is daily first plus a financial frame, daily first plus an environmental frame. Okay, so very similar, if you kind of grasp the structure of the lab study design, very similar design, but we just picked the top 2 performers. Interim, so these data are interim. All of what follows now is take it with a pinch of salt. We will be doing more robust data analysis as we get the data through, but sort of sharing here in the spirit of sort of being open and transparent. So if you see slightly different results from us in 3 or 4 months' time, don't shout at me. Okay, so the message frame, so this is the email study. What we find is similar results to the lab study, actually. So relative to the control, just flipping to the daily first, so just changing that order, it's really small tweak, leads about a percentage point and a half more people to opt in to being part of this daily program. It's a reasonable jump. We see that adding the financial frame adds a little bit more, another half a percentage point, and then no real jump from daily first to environmental in this study. This financial frame is actually the only one that is statistically significant, given the sample we had. Daily first and the environmental are trending, they're pretty close, but this is the only one that we can kind of say with some certainty based on our current analysis is working. So the one-liner here is, if you're looking to encourage people to opt into a daily parking program, use an email that emphasizes the financial loss and gain that comes out of it. And another takeaway is, don't always believe lab studies. So we had the environmental frame was the best performer in the lab study, and that flips to the financial frame in the real world. So there's probably something going on here with social desirability. People want to think that they're environmentally minded. They want to tell you in an online study, in an online survey, that they're environmentally minded. But when the rubber hits the road, they're probably slightly more motivated by money. Of course, this is a study run in August. We have the pandemic going on. There's a whole load of caveats, but it's interesting nonetheless to see this sort of direct 2-step and the comparison that comes out of it. Okay, so that's study number, well, the lab study and then field study 1. The just checking, I want to make sure I'm not going too far over time. Someone please let me know if I'm taking too long. The second study really is the killer study. This is the one we really want to run, and it's saying, can we get at the impact on behavior, so impact on driving of the introduction of a daily parking program. This is the one that MIT study, that's Children's Seattle's Hospital study, that Singapore research has all sort of flirted with, but no one's really got this killer individual level RCT that can show the impact and estimate the impact of daily parking. So we really want to run that, and we set up this experimental, this sort of evaluation situation with the Vanderbilt program, where we set up a wait list. So we got lots of people to opt in, as we just saw in the previous slide. And then we set up a scenario where we randomly held some people back. So we were saying, we're only going to give this to some people initially, we're randomly going to hold some people back. And that gives us this, like, everyone's the same because they've all opted in, and some people are getting it and some people aren't. And we were hoping to then be able to measure the impact on driving over time. But unfortunately, to sort of cut to the crunch, COVID made life really difficult through the autumn, and we were not able to hold back that waitlist control. Not enough people drove to make the program viable. So basically had to release the control group into the population. So we lost that point of comparison. So we're very, very, very hopeful that we'll be able to run this again with our excellent Vanderbilt partners in the fall semester of 21. So this coming fall semester. So I guess stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be able to get that killer RCT that we're all really, really excited for. So study 2 is a bit of a flop so far, still in progress. Study 3 is saying, drawing on that awareness of payment mechanism that I talked about at the start. So we sort of think broadly that people are generally not aware of how much they're paying for parking, and increasing the awareness or increasing the pain of payment around daily parking may discourage driving. And we know that people are motivated around money from that email study and that lab study. So increasing that sort of awareness of the financial implications could potentially have an impact. So we set up a study where we played with the, we created a scenario where we could send people receipts from their parking. So each time we have an excellent RA named Crystal, who's working on the Vanderbilt side, who is able to in the background identify all the people who in a given week or a given day drive, and then we can send them one of 4 different conditions. So we have a control group who get no parking receipt, and then we have a group who get a receipt if they drive in a day. Then they receive at the end of the day a notification. Think like an Uber receipt where you get sent an email saying this was your trip, it was $10. It was at the end of the day they get a hey, thanks for driving today, or thanks for parking, we charged you $3. Then they get another condition gets that message daily plus a loss aversion message, and I'll give you an example of what that is shortly. And then we have the same split, but done weekly, the end of the week rather than at the end of the day. So we're sort of measuring what happens if we bombard people and what happens if we put that loss aversion message in. Here are examples of what they look like. So this is the daily one just on its own. This is the weekly one just on its own. And then these are daily and weekly with you can see we've added in, we're calling it a loss aversion message, but it's really more than that. It's like we're also giving information on, hey, you could cycle like this, you could bus like this, you could carpool like this, etc. So it's kind of loss aversion plus options as well. So warning, what will come now is really, really, really interim. We're literally working on these today and yesterday. So pinch of salt advised. What we're able to do so far is just look at the study, look at driving behavior over time. So what we have here is the weeks. So these are all this year, Jan through to March last week. And we have the onset of the emails is this yellow dotted line. So we have this baseline period. And this gray line now is just a control. So I'm just showing you, these are people who didn't get any emails. I'm just showing you, tracking the variability, sort of natural fluctuation across semester. Also note for those sharp-eyed, we're missing a week in here. There was a snowstorm in Vanderbilt and we just excluded that week because it was flat, no one drove at all. So when I jump ahead, these 2 lines now show you the 2 daily conditions. So you can see the dark blue is daily on its own, the light blue is daily with loss aversion. And you can see here very much, again, pinch of salt, but maybe we're starting to see that at least relative to daily without loss aversion, that the daily loss aversion is starting to peter down and sort of reduce the amount that people drive on average. Oh, I should sort of qualify, this is across the whole population, the average trips per week by condition. So on average, people drive like less than once a week in our sample. Given it's COVID, I think this is probably about right. So if we click on, you can see these are the 2 weekly ones. One of the things to flag out is there's just quite a bit of variability here that just naturally came out with our randomization. It seems like there's it's a sample where it's quite varied. And so we, in our analysis, we're really going to have to look at this more closely. Again, pinch of salt, these are interim stats. But the weekly ones don't really seem to be playing the same ball game. Loss aversion, the weekly loss aversion did start to look like it was doing a similar thing to the daily, but comes closer towards the end. So really, who knows? I think the best we can say for now is that maybe the daily loss aversion is going in the right direction, but check back in a couple of months when we've done a better job of the analysis. Okay, so to run through some of these just in a flash, and I really want to make sure I'm not taking up too much time. The lab study, ordering seems to be a very simple thing you can just change the order, put the thing you want people to do at the top. Very, very simple behavioral science, make it easy for people to do the thing you want. And maybe the financial and environmental frames in the lab study, particularly the environmental frame, seems to be doing pretty well. In that email study, it looks like the financial frame and ordering again, increase uptake to daily parking. That policy study is the cool one, and we haven't run it. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll run it in the future. And the receipt study is still in progress, but it looks like maybe daily and loss aversion, basically pinging people loads over and over again saying, by the way, you're losing, by the way, you're losing, here are other options. Maybe that is starting to work. And of course, more research needed. So 2 final slides from me on a few more ideas. One is we'd love to play with some sort of incremental pricing game. We have split loyalties in the team about whether, so actually I'll explain this a little bit more. What we're trying to do with that sort of daily versus flat fee idea, this is just a hypothetical graph, is really the comparison between this line and this line. We're saying some people are going to just be charged monthly or annually for a fee. Some people are going to be charged weekly or daily. And we want to see, does breaking down that payment lead to a change in behavior? We're trying to get at that. We would also love to play one of these incremental games where we set it up so like either the pricing is incrementally getting higher as you go through the week or the month, and so it starts low and gets higher. And that would be interesting because you're saying, okay, you can drive and park a few times, but if you keep doing it, it's going to get more expensive, or the other way around. It starts high and gets lower. We're sort of split as to which one of those would be most effective, but there's something there here in sort of changing the variability of it, which could be really cool. And then we're also interested in trying to play with pre-commitments, forcing people to pre-commit the beginning of the week or month on the number of times they're going to drive in a week, maybe even prepaying for the number of times they're going to drive. If they then want to do more, they have to go through a sort of friction-filled process to get more. And then we're interested in incentive matching, basically saying like if employers are giving subsidies to parking, if you're not driving and parking, let's also give them equivalent subsidies in some other way. So this is rather than just adding friction, also adding some sort of motivational fuel. Okay, I'll pause there and hand over.
Okay, Rachel, are you ready?
I will try again.
All right, let's try it again.
Now I've got 2 computers running, so if one explodes, there we go. Then we'll see what happens on the other one. So thank you, Joey, for an excellent presentation. And although while mine is more general and did make sense the way that we had ordered them originally, one of the things that Joey's presentation really underscores is the thing I had started to say about why I wanted to go a little bit off script. Because in the university context where there's a restricted parking supply, pricing is possible, right? So in the condition that most of us face in our cities and downtowns, there's actually an excess of parking. And so pricing options become very difficult because because there's just another parking place somewhere else. And so I want to start by talking a little bit about how we got to where we are, and then how we can use parking pricing as more of a TDM strategy. So the reason that I call the talk Parking Not as Bad as You Think is because it's actually much easier to find a parking place than people believe it is. And then it's worse than you realize because the fact of the oversupply has such important implications for our modal choices. So I was doing an estimate the other day of parking in the New York region for a different project that I'm working on, and there's a minimum of 5 parking spaces per vehicle in the region. And that's fairly typical. I've heard even higher estimates, but when you sort of turn that on its head, what you learn is, or you think about that, means 80% of parking spaces are unused at any given time, right? So if there's 5 parking places per vehicle, assuming all vehicles are parked, that means there are 4 empty spaces. And if cars are in motion, frequently there's even more. So originally we defined the problem of the parking problem as there being too little parking. So this is a photo from the 1930s on the banks of the Schuylkill, where we really sort of gave over the waterfront to cars. So there's an easy fix if there's too little parking. That is just to require more parking. So this is a typical situation where there's just a lot of asphalt and it's not typically utilized. Why? Because there's 80% of parking is actually available at any given time. So the problem is solved, right? But no, so then you wind up introducing a host of other kinds of problems. Here's a relatively recent development in New York City that's 485,000 square feet of retail, and the accompanying parking is 686,000 square feet. So we have more parking than ratables, more parking than active usable space. So the accessory use dominates. And in this particular example, as in many examples, the maximum observed parking occupancy is 40% of the supply. Now, when your maximum observed is only 40% of your supply, it starts to become very difficult to price it, especially because now the developer has got into some orientation where they want actually to bring more parking in. There's another mall development example I like to talk about in DC. It's a USA Mall, where the city itself, the city planning department and the economic development group had a fight with themselves about how much parking should be required. And they actually supplied, because it was their contribution to the project. So the city wound up supplying half the parking that the city itself would require. And then that was only ever 50% utilized. So then they have this massive unutilized parking. And so the city wanted to recoup some of its investment, so went around into the neighborhood and said, hey, we have all this extra parking. Why don't your employees come and park here? And drew people off transit because of that. So before we really can get to these good TDM pricing strategies, we need to think in terms of some TDM supply strategies, which is just another example of how much space is devoted. Typically, this is sort of the zoning. For 1,000 square feet of office, you need usually about 1,000 square feet of parking as well. So then there's a huge opportunity cost of that. So friends of mine like to say, okay, you could have, you could put in 32 diners in your restaurant. You could have 3 people in an office cubicle. I also like to turn that around a little bit. 2 parking spaces makes a very nice apartment, a nice studio apartment. So there we have these kinds of questions. And then what we wind up having is often a serious mismanagement. I'm going to show you 2 examples. This is Ahmedabad and here's Harbin, China. 2 international examples that I like, where what I'm showing you here is on the left-hand frame is what's happening on the street. And what you see in the right-hand frame is in the same building immediately below, where you're completely congested. And you have these empty parking garages. So what happens is the optics are, someone drives up here onto the street area and they say, oh, there isn't any parking available. And so we have this idea in our minds that we have this crisis of shortage of parking, but we have generally is this crisis of failure to manage the parking. So, so then what happens, people also then do drive around, because if that parking lot is priced, and the on-street parking is free, then you have a lot of cruising for parking, and it pays. Let's say you're going somewhere, it's $10 an hour to park, and you're going to spend 10 minutes circling around looking for a free spot or a meter at $1 an hour. So in 10 minutes, you saved $20, which is equivalent to paying yourself $120 an hour, is how an economist would think about it. So cruising for parking is a very good bet given the pricing structures that we have. So of course, requiring parking did introduce other new kinds of problems, and then these perceptions that we have. This is a very typical parking utilization map. This particular study is the city of Oxnard. Where you see green, there's plenty of parking available. Where you see red, there's limited parking. So everybody wants to park here, so they drive to that street. Well, there's no parking. So then what's natural is to have a fit and blame the city and say there isn't any parking. And then, oh, lo and behold, just in the block, I'm trying to use my pointer, but it seems to be rushing off the screen. I don't know if you can see that. I'm pointing to the very top of the map. Just the block next to that, there's plenty of parking available, right? So this all winds up being a question of pricing and management. And there's some very good examples. San Francisco and Seattle come to mind immediately for cities that have implemented what they call performance pricing, which is they'll price a block, Los Angeles as well, so that they can control the occupancy and use those price signals to shift demand from the full blocks to the empty blocks. There's all kinds of cases where the community and the councils think the solution is to build another garage, but as you can see here in the Oxnard example, there are also plenty of garage spaces available. So this is sort of typical of the San Francisco example, SF Park, if some of you have heard of it, where what you have is too much parking in particular places, and there you have the empty lot. So then if you price so this is a question of whether you're gonna, what we typically have is cheap on-street parking and expensive off-street parking. But if you flip that around and have the on-street parking more expensive and the off-street parking less expensive, you will start distributing your demand in a way that utilizes your supply more effectively and starts to give you the kinds of outcomes that you wanted. I had actually eliminated this slide. One other thing I want to talk about, and then we'll turn it more to Q&A, is the impracticality of how we think of what parking minimums should be, right? We regulate parking as a function of what the land use is, but buildings are very durable and uses change, and they can be quite dynamic. The example on the upper right is the Musée d'Orsay. So my question always is, does an art museum and a train station have the same parking needs, right? So the left-hand side is the Limelight, which was a notorious discotheque during the 80s and 90s in New York City. But most of you will look at that picture and recognize it as a house of worship. And in fact, it was a church for 150, 200 years before it became a disco. And now it's a set of boutique malls. So do a church, a disco, a mall, do they have the same parking requirements? No, not particularly. So adaptive reuse starts to become quite difficult because we've attached our parking requirements to what the land use is. And here you go, even according to the code, the church needed 210 spaces, the nightclub needed fewer, and a mall even fewer. So which sort of suggests that city planners have an expectation that the retail mall will turn over. But the curious thing too about the church condition is the church needs 210 spaces once or twice a week, which means, again, all those spaces wind up being idle the remainder of the time. One of the pictures I showed that I didn't talk about was the Berkeley Bowl, which was a bowling alley for a number of years, and then it was a grocery store for a number of years after. And again, now in both of these cases, these buildings predate what the parking requirements and had less parking, in fact. And similarly in residential uses, right? If you sort of think of somebody going through their life cycle stages and the number of cars that they own, you start out, you don't have a car, you finished college, you get a car, you get to reach your late 20s, early 30s, you get married, your household has 2 cars. Then for a few years in there, you've got a couple of kids who are teenagers. And so maybe you have 3 cars in your household, then the kids move on and your household car ownership profile drops down to 0. Meanwhile, you've got a 3-car garage associated with that house because you want to accommodate just that peak there. So, and the problem is then it gives us these failed reuse attempts, right? So this is an example from St. Paul that I like to that I've heard. So this location that's pictured on the upper right is right down here. It's this building here, and it was a toy store for a number of years, which required 3 parking spaces, and it had 3 parking spaces. And then the toy store went out of business. So somebody wanted to open a restaurant, a wine bar in that location, but the wine bar needed 9 spaces. So they went over here to this development on the corner and asked the dry cleaner if they could rent 6 spaces to meet their parking requirement. And the dry cleaner, which operates during the daytime and would need their spaces in the day, compared with the wine bar that needs their spaces in the evening, was happy to do that, but wanted a clause saying that they could have their spaces back if they needed them. So the zoning board, the variance was not granted. So the community essentially said, and this obviously you can see is a context where there's plenty of available parking within this same block and in the neighborhood. So for want of 6 spaces that would be empty half the time, the development was denied. So suggesting that an empty storefront was better use if there weren't the 6 additional spaces. So I'll just this one slide that I skipped over right here, I'll just talk about that for one quick second again. So what happens is if you share in most conditions that I've seen, in fact, if you use more shared parking, you can provide, even using ITE's suggested minimum parking amounts for each use, you will wind up providing about 2/3 less parking than if you just supplied the uses individually. And that is owing entirely to the fact that different uses have different time of day peaking characteristics. So we have this insane oversupply, which makes it very difficult then to apply any kind of pricing. In fact, on average, parking is oversupplied by 40 to 60% in small downtowns all across the United States. And so with that kind of oversupply, you don't have the pricing lever, and it makes it very difficult it sort of promotes an automobile modal choice for a variety of reasons. So I'll end it there and look forward to discussion with the group and teasing out some more ideas as we go through some of the Q&A.
Yeah, so I can moderate the Q&A here. We have a couple questions in the chat that we answered in the chat, but we're hoping, Michael from Vanderbilt, maybe you can actually talk through yours live. So the question that was asked was, who is responsible for sending the emails? This is for Joey's presentation. Does it take staff time, and who sends the receipts? And so Michael is the Assistant Director of Mobility at Vanderbilt, and he can speak to that one now.
Hey everyone, glad to hop on. Sorry I was a few minutes late. So yeah, this has been a great opportunity that we've had with Joey's team. And so when this came up, this was something that we talked, because we're using Loom for our Move VU Commute Hub, and it has a communications platform within it. So we have an intern that she is working on her master's in civil engineering and is really good at data and kind of like managing data and really just interested in all kinds of transportation data. So she each afternoon, probably around 3:45, 4 o'clock, pulls the daily parking activity, populates it through a framework that Joey's team helped streamline for us to track which versions each person gets, and then those who park that day and are part of the daily parking get an email. Then at the end of the week on Friday, she compiles them for those that are on the weekly email list and sends those. So she does that each afternoon. Probably takes 30 minutes now that it's streamlined in order to do that, but it is a manual process that we've set up between Joey's team to track it within an Excel database, and then using the communication tools within the Loom platform to communicate that out.
If I may jump in there. So this is an example of where we come up with an idea and it's sometimes difficult to sort of build out the full technology straight away. That's going to take Loom time and money to do, to be able to like track and send daily receipts like you would get with Uber, for example. And so what we do in the background is we say, okay, we're going to mimic for the user what it would be like if we'd built this out. And so in this scenario, that is saying, hey, Crystal, who is excellent, can you please spend 30 minutes a day doing this manually in the background? If it works and we show ultimately that these receipts are a good idea in terms of reducing driving behavior, we will go to Loom, we'll go to Kelly and say, hey, please build this for real because it seems like it's working. But this is just a prototype. So you have like, you know, the graceful swan on the top for the user, and in the background we're kicking really hard to try and make it work. This is a strategy that we adopt a lot with experimentation, and this is just a really nice example.
It's a wonderful analogy. I can picture it. Thank you, Crystal. Okay, so we have a couple questions in the chat for Rachel. So first question for you, Rachel, is, are parking minimums ever a good idea in development? What is a good alternative?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. So there's no demand really for parking per se, right? There's demand for access. And to the extent that the only way to get somewhere, and particularly in low density situation, it's going to be automobile, then you have to provide parking to accommodate that. So you could argue it on all kinds of sides. So to some extent, it's a question of ideology. I would say that if a developer chooses to develop somewhere, I'll stop myself. I'm going to just retrace that. Parking minimums are never a good idea, because the developer is always free to provide as much parking as they want, right? As they feel is required for the success of their project. Frequently, what I hear too is people think that a parking garage is a good economic development strategy because that businesses will follow if the parking is made available. But if you have a dense enough walking district, then you don't actually need to rely on that kind of parking. So to a large extent, these really are all design decisions. And what starts to happen is increasingly communities are flipping their minimums, in fact, to maximums, because they also are seeing that they have excess parking, and requiring parking all along really does it just disperses your land uses. I'll give an example. Sacramento did a fabulous thing a few years ago. They built a 35,000 seat stadium downtown, and they did not include one single new parking space with that stadium. Instead, what they did is they identified office buildings in the area, and they entered into contractual relationships with the owners of those properties so that that parking could be made available to people who are coming to the stadium, either for sports events or music events or what have you. And they also continued to promote alternative means of access. So we think of transportation systems in terms of, this is back to engineering school, right? There's rights of way, there's vehicles, and there's terminals, right? For airplanes, it's the terminal is the airport, the vehicle is the airplane, the right of way is the sky. For buses, it's a bus stop or the end of the line. For cars, we have roads, the vehicle is the car, and the parking space is the terminal, right? So the system has to be in balance with that. And so how we move around really is a question of choice. It's a policy choice, and how we want to build that. So.
Thank you, Rachel. I love that example as well. Another question for you. Sharing parking makes perfect sense, but what are the barriers and how can they be overcome? Is it a liability? As an example, there's an office parking lot next to a movie theater, but movie patrons are towed if they park in the office lot. The lot is completely empty on Saturday evenings. So maybe relates directly to your Sacramento example there, maybe.
Yeah, so it's certainly a liability if your automobile is going to get towed. But if there's a formal arrangement, then that doesn't happen. And that's the perfect example, right? So the liability question comes up frequently, particularly if you're in an office building that then has access to the building through the garage. There's some questions there. several towns in California, and I can't recall right offhand which they are, but if somebody wants me to follow that up, I can, or I recommend you track down a fellow called Patrick Siegman, who I used to work with, where the city has contracted to lease the parking garages or lots from some of the businesses in order to facilitate the relationship so that the liability fear is mitigated. So that, you know, if you get enough lawyers in the room, you can figure out some solutions to these things. And I'm sure occasionally there will be cases where if you have it, you know, if it's a high security building and you have a high security access, that might not be your best sharing candidate. But certainly if it's surface lots, you know, it makes it a quite easy relationship.
Wonderful. So we have a question from Tracy that she'll ask Joey live.
Yeah, Joey, I think your presentation was wonderful. Rachel as well, wonderful presentations. I just want to know, do we know what those people, how they commute after like kind of the dip? So if they decided not to park or not to drive anymore, did they hop on transit? Did they start biking or walking? Do we know what they did yet? You know, if they changed their commute?
We have no idea yet, but we are cooking up the parking receipt study in particular is set to run, I think, till about the end of April. And we're cooking up a survey that we're going to send towards the end, sort of like third, fourth week of April, to everyone who's in it, including the control group, and ask a series of questions around commuting behavior, like if did you drive, and just we'll see if that corroborates, because they don't necessarily know that we're tracking driving behavior, so we'll just be able to corroborate that. And then alternative modes as well, so like biking, carpooling, teleworking, all of these things. And so we'll be able to get a sense of that. We're also going to look at happiness while commuting and see if we got people to not drive, do they then report being happier while commuting? I'd love it if we could show that. Similarly, healthier, like if they get more exercise while commuting. We can see the theory of change. I'm not sure if we'll get it bear out in the data, but it'll be interesting to see if it does. And also we'll be asking about, like, did you see these receipts? Did they piss you off? And how much? So yes, sorry, the answer directly to your question is we don't know yet, but we have a plan. So hopefully next time we present this, we'll be able to give some idea.
Great. And Rachel, not to throw another topic in there, but parking cash out is kind of a hot topic. I know where I am, you know, everybody wants to see a real true example of parking cash out, and they're just so hard to find. Yeah. Are there any good ones that we could try to model?
So you completely read my mind. I just was going to say, you know, I want to expand on Joey's answer and talk about parking cash out. So it is the law in California that if your business is 100 employees or more, you are required to offer parking cash out. So for those who don't know, and I apologize if everybody knows, it's hard to know the audience in these kind of situations, but parking cash out is essentially a program that recognizes that free parking is a perk. So, and free parking is free to the employee who uses free parking, but it is not necessarily free to the employer. So the idea in parking cash out is the employer would say to the employee, I spend $100 a month for your parking space, which I then provide to you as my employee as a job benefit. Would you rather have the cash? Or not even, or skip the question that says, would you rather, and just say, instead of giving you your parking space, here's the cash. Now you can keep the cash, or you can give it back to me and you can park there. So basically I'm giving you the money, you're paying for your parking space. So there's a lot of talk about it, Tracy, as you said. In terms of what's written up in the research and the literature, there's very little. There's eight projects in California, I think from the 90s, that are written up. But the thing that's interesting in them is in places where there are alternatives, it's easy to keep the cash. You save the money, it's in your pocket, and you have good viable options for getting to work. But even in places that were in remote locations that did not have a good alternative, people still reduced their drive alone mode share and they carpooled, right? So you'd get together with your colleague and just say, hey, let's, you know, split the cash out back. I mean, it also works less in that context, again, because the land is cheaper, the parking is surface parking, and so the cash out isn't as big. Let me just remember what the name is. That I think Coalition for Smarter Growth. They've done some interesting stuff writing up a model cash out policy, which I think is certainly worth looking at. I think DC Council passed a cash out law recently, and yeah, I mean, the economics of it, the theory of it makes perfect sense, and then tangentially, any place you see where people pay for parking, there is less drive alone to work commuting, and so that really is canary in the coal mine, if you will. I haven't got such good analogies as Joey's got, but that tells you what outcome you would expect. If parking costs you money, you are not going to just automatically knee-jerk take it. So I think, to me, parking cash out is a no-brainer. The catch that I haven't figured out yet is, for all your employees who aren't currently parking, you also have to give them the cash, and that could be quite expensive for the employer. But there is a way to figure that out.
Thank you.
And I think with that, we have just less than a minute left. So I would like to say thank you so much to Joey and Rachel for your presentations. They were very informative and interesting. And if you have any questions, you know, feel free to follow up with our speakers. I hope that's okay. I just said that. They're nodding and shrugging. So yes. And look out for more of these webinars. Tracy and I are collaborating with our 2 chapters to do a part 2 and part 3 of the parking series. So stay tuned for more in the coming months.
I want to throw in one last comment, if I may.
Yes.
Before we all go, I just want to put a plug in for the international conference. Whether you can go or not, they are looking for judges for the annual awards. And I will say, from previous years of having done it, this is a great opportunity to, you know, see what other people are doing. But I'm going to put the contact information in the chat. If you're interested in doing that, contact Courtney Schultz and Emily Haar. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Emily. I think it's a really good opportunity. I'm not sure exactly what their timeline is, but definitely check that out. So I'll just say thank you there. And thanks again to our speakers as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks all. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.